Are you from China? You speak Chinese. So, but you're from Malaysia? Are any of you from monolingual countries like, say, Japan, the US, the UK, or Australia, where everyone is more or less expected to speak one language and speak it well? By the way, a Scouse accent...
We're all camping up, we were all struggling, but it's unbelievable. I mean, as I said, Steve grew up with the stories of the past, now it's our chance to have our own.
It's barely English, but it is still English. In this video, I'm going to talk about the demographics of Malaysia, colonial rule, when to speak what language, the fluency with which Malaysians can speak their various languages and the impact on their international reputation, education, and how this all differs to that of other countries. So for any of you that have spent some time in Malaysia, either because you've lived here for a while or maybe you had a really good friend or partner that's from Malaysia, you might be able to relate to the content of this video pretty well. Let's begin with an ethnic breakdown of Malaysia. So Malaysia consists of the Bumiputra, the Chinese, and the Indians. For the purposes of inter-ethnic communication, Malay absolutely is considered the go-to language. However, English is also really commonly used, especially in the larger cities like KL and Penang. To use some real-life examples, let's say you're dealing with your passport, your license, you're going to be speaking Malay. In fact, it's quite weird to speak English or any other language other than Malay in such environments. In a corporate setting, at a high-end retail store, a fancy restaurant, you'd be expected to speak English. At a mamak, Malay. At a slightly high-end mamak, probably a mixture of English and Malay. At a hawker centers are generally more Chinese influenced. If it's run by Chinese, then you'd probably be speaking Mandarin if you're Chinese, or possibly another Chinese dialect like Cantonese, Hokkien, or Hakka. Hakka is pretty rare actually at hawker centers. Or if it's run by foreign workers, you'd be speaking a combination of English, Malay, and possibly some sort of Chinese that the foreign worker might have picked up on the job. Let me give you some real-life examples that I have. I know a Chinese Malaysian guy who doesn't speak English very well, but speaks Mandarin, Cantonese, Hokkien, more or less as his primary languages, of course with some Malay. He's Malaysian. I know another Malaysian Chinese guy who speaks English as essentially his first language, speaks some Malay, hardly speaks any Chinese.
So, some people regard Minghan and myself as bananas. What is a banana? Yellow on the outside, white on the inside.
He's Malaysian too. And of course you've got Malays who speak Malay, probably some English, and then you've also got the Indian Malaysians who can speak probably Tamil, some English, and Malay. These guys are all Malaysian, and I don't really believe that anyone considers these guys to be any less Malaysian than the other. I've also noticed this phenomenon where you've got Chinese Malaysians whose primary language is some sort of Chinese, but their primary language for texting or choosing a language to be used on their devices like their laptop is English. Talking a little bit about the colonial past of Malaysia will actually help you understand why the ethnic groups have congregated together and why they've continued to speak and be able to retain the language to such a strong level. Of course, it doesn't mean things couldn't have changed, but I believe looking at history often helps you understand how things came to be today. The British employed this strategy that was known as divide and rule. Broadly speaking, they wanted to divide the various ethnic groups to be all together, and they believed that this would make it easier for them to control the various populations and ethnic groups. The side effect, though, was that these ethnic groups continued to speak their own language. Malaysia gained independence in 1957, and of course Malay has always been the national language, so that's why Malay is still definitely considered the main language. However, the extent to which this actually left a lasting impact on Malaysia in terms of how people communicate is quite different to that of neighboring countries. When it comes to looking at neighboring countries, you could look at a place like, say, Indonesia. I believe the Chinese of Indonesia went through a somewhat similar history to that of Chinese Malaysians. That is, you had a bunch of southern Chinese migrants who decided to leave China either due to communism, to escape war, or in the search of gold. And a lot of them ended up in various Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. The difference is the Chinese Indonesian were actually required to change their last names to be more Indonesian. I learned from a video by Fearless Passport where she was comparing Malaysian Chinese to Indonesian Chinese that the Indonesians actually found a way to integrate their Chinese last name into their Indonesian last name, which I thought was really interesting. So what that meant was it was possible to trace back what their original Chinese last name was. According to some sources that I came across, learning Chinese in Indonesia was banned from around 1967 until around 1990. That is a very different situation to what happened in Malaysia, where they have what are known as vernacular schools. By the way, I had no idea what vernacular meant until I started researching this topic. It's such a strange word, but it's also useful. As a result of that, what that meant was you'd have schools in Malaysia that primarily teach in Chinese or Malay, and of course international schools that also teach in primarily English. As far as I'm aware, they all need to teach Malay as well, as it's the national language, although I'm not sure if that applies for international schools. What does that mean today for Malaysia? As a result, you have a lot of Chinese people in Malaysia that actually can't speak Malay too well. Now, I don't really want to touch on whether or not I think this is a good or bad thing. That's not the point of this video. I just think it's very interesting though, because this is almost unheard of from those monolingual countries that I mentioned. I've never heard of a Chinese Malaysian family that speaks Malay at home as their primary language, or primary language that they use for socializing with friends. If any of you do know anyone like that though, I'd be really curious because I feel like they're so rare. And you see, that's quite different to Chinese Indonesians who do speak Indonesian amongst themselves, within their family, and amongst their friends. Can you imagine meeting someone that has grown up in Australia from the age of 1, 2, or was born and raised there, and not being able to speak English well? It's super rare and it's so unusual. Whereas in Malaysia, it's not unusual. Can you imagine being in Japan and then someone says, hey, I want to open up a German school. Not a German language school, but a German school where everything is taught in German. Because a German language school seems to imply that it's something additional, but a German school. And same in Australia. Can you imagine if you wanted to open up a Malay school or a Chinese school? Having said that, I understand that there are Arabic schools in Australia, but I don't know much about them.
Australian International Islamic College, an education that challenges students to be lifelong learners.
Coming back to education in Malaysia, I also understand that during the post-war period of Malaysia, there was a time where, say, subjects like history, geography, science were taught in Malay, and another time where they were taught in English. And what I also heard was that as a result of this yo-yoing that happened, you have this group of people who are above the age of about 65 who can speak English better than they can speak Malay. And then you have that middle group of people between the age of about 40 and 65 who can speak Malay better than they can speak English. And then finally the younger generation, where I feel like it's going back towards English.
How long were you away again? A year? Few months? Don't be silly. Just 4 weeks, days. 4 days.
Speaking about the fluency with which Malaysians can speak the various languages, it's not quite at a native level, but it's most certainly at a conversational level at the very least. So whether that be, say, Malay or English, probably the two most common ones for Malaysians, and then if you're Chinese, probably Mandarin, Cantonese, Hokkien, Hakka, and then for Indians, Tamil, possibly some Hindi, it is typically at least at a conversational level, which I think is super impressive. But what that means is it's resulted in people having this impression that Malaysians can speak so many different languages. And whilst that is true, I think it's just important to keep in mind that the level at which they can speak it is often not considered to be quite the same as that of, say, a native speaker. So let's say you're from mainland China and you hear a Malaysian Chinese person speaking Chinese. You probably wouldn't quite consider it native, unless you were, say, Southern Chinese, because the accent sounds a little bit more similar. But otherwise, you might think of it as a very different brand of Chinese, and these guys can speak it well. It's a similar story for English. If you're from, say, the UK or Australia and you heard a Malaysian speaking English, you'd probably hear it and think they're really fluent. But there is still a tinge of an accent. And obviously, without going into details about whether or not someone's super fluent, and also without talking about code switching, which some people are able to do, by and large, Malaysia is not considered an English-speaking country. What happens sometimes overseas when people that aren't familiar with Chinese Malaysians meet Chinese Malaysians, they ask, hey, are you from China? Maybe Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea? Wait, but you speak Chinese. But you're from Malaysia? Don't you speak Malay? Wait, but you speak English as well? Hang on. What's going on? This doesn't make any sense to me. I think it's also important to consider the impact that this has had on Malaysia's ability to be international. Because if Malaysia was a little bit more aggressive about implementing Malay as the language, I think Malaysia would probably be a little bit more like Indonesia, which is probably a bit less international than Malaysia is. And that can be seen in the proficiency of English of your average Indonesian. If I recall correctly, it's only about 1% of Indonesia's population that is considered to be able to speak English. But I can't remember where I heard that from. On the other hand, Malaysia, according to a quick Google, 50% of Malaysians can speak English. We can also talk a little bit about Singapore. Singapore is a country that has a similar history and background and many overlaps with Malaysia. The demographics, in fact, are almost the same. But the three races of Bumiputra, Chinese, and Malay are the same three that make up the bulk of the Singaporean population. It's just that the proportions are a little bit different. They took a very different approach. They took an approach where English became the official language, whilst Malay, Chinese, and Tamil are co-official languages. The national anthem of Singapore is in Malay. Having said that, English is definitely more prevalent in Singapore than it is in Malaysia. And the impact I think that has had on its successes today can't be ignored. And I also think that by choosing English as the language, they chose a sort of safe approach. You might be thinking, how is that safe? They've chosen a language that is not the primary language of any of the three races. And you're right. But I say safe because they took an option which didn't risk irking any of the three races. And they chose a neutral language, which was also somewhat logical because of the colonial history as well as the international appeal. And there we have it. If you guys have any comments, I'd love to hear any suggestions, any points of improvement, or even any corrections in case I've said anything wrong. I'm really happy to hear. Please leave a comment down below. Give me a like if you liked the video. Give me a dislike if you didn't like the video. But I'd really like if you could tell me what you didn't like. And I'll see you in the next one.
We were all cramping up, we were all struggling, but I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, as I said, me and Steve, we grew up with the stories of the past. Now it's our chance to have our own little bit of it.
Hey, I'm still here. Mr. Money TV has just dropped a new video where he speaks about the education system in Malaysia. He actually speaks a little bit about that going back and forth between teaching subjects in English and Malay that I spoke about. He goes into a lot more detail than I did though. I mean, that wasn't the focus of my video. But in case any of you guys want to check it out, I'll leave a link somewhere here or maybe down below. See you guys soon.